All right. My agenda today is obviously to cover, like Dr. Little said, the 45th Illinois, and mainly focusing again on the Vicksburg campaign. So before talking about their experiences, I'm going to first discuss the debate amongst historians whether the Civil War was a total war, or, as some say, no, it just became a hard war. And this is all relative to wars in the past. So first we'll go through both sides of that and kind of give you some definitions about what total war and hard war mean, and talk about the key people who've written on the subject. Then I'll bring you from the 45th mustering into service, and then time up to Jackson, Tennessee, all work previous to the Vicksburg campaign. And of course we'll be focusing on the Vicksburg campaign and basically highlight the differences between their experiences before the Vicksburg campaign and after. And then briefly go through the rest of the war and their service, and then bring up some conclusions that can come from this study. Oh, you're going to do it, okay. All right, so total war. It's the mobilization of all resources of a highly centralized state, government, country for military conflict with unlimited war aims and the unrestricted use of force against the enemy's armies and civilian populations alike. Note here that it's also destroying what would be the home front. It's extermination, it's genocide, there's no rules, there's no limits. Now, how many wars have been like that? Not many, but there's aspects of that, and it's all dependent on your viewpoint of what total war is. Hard war, and how Mark Grimsley put it with respect to the Civil War, is actions against the Southern civilians and their property to demoralize them, ruin the Confederate economy, industries, transportation network. The key here with hard war as opposed to total war is that total war, the lines between a combatant and a civilian, or women, children, and the men fighting, there's no distinction. Here in the hard war, there is a distinction. Now, you can always pull instances out where civilians were hurt, raped, murdered by Union soldiers, but the difference here is total war, it's common. Total war, you see it across. In total war, you also see direct money, resources, people devoted to destroying economic resources, and large numbers of people. That's their job. Where in hard war, not necessarily. It happens happenstance, or it happens because of need. So I have several authors up here that spoke on total war. The first one of note is John Bennett Walters in 1948. He blamed everything on Sherman. Sherman created total war. He gradually evolved his own philosophy of war and became one of the first of the modern generals to revert to the idea of the use of military force against civilians. And Walters said he demonstrated an effectiveness of a plan of action which would destroy the enemy's economic system and terrify and demoralize the civilians. By paralyzing the enemy's economy and destroying the ability to supply its armies, and by despoiling and scattering the families of soldiers in the opposing army, he undermined the morale of the Confederate military. Walter started the excoriation of Sherman and the blaming of Sherman as his creator of total war. Bruce Canton in 1952 said on Grant, he was fighting a total war. And in a total war, the enemy's economy is undermined in any way possible. T. Harry Williams said, again, the Civil War was the first of the total modern wars. And later, in 1960, he kind of backed off of that a little bit. He said, tried as it may say that the Civil War was the first of the modern wars, but this is the truth that needs to be repeated. If the Civil War was not quite total, it missed totality by a narrow margin. Emory Thomas, speaking of the Confederacy, said they were fighting a total war, and in doing so, they gave up most of their cherished traditions. Philip Pluden said on Grant's war making had come to stand for the American way of war. For one thing, the image is one of total war demanding unconditional surrender. Many historians have linked unconditional surrender as something, if it's there, then the war is more total. James McPherson, preeminent scholar on the Civil War, in 3 works, noted Civil War. He said the war had become willy-nilly, a total war rather than a limited war. When the Civil War became a total war, the invading army intentionally destroyed the economic capacity of the South to wage war. That was in 1986. In 88, in Battle Cry of Freedom, he stated that by 63, Lincoln's remarkable abilities gave him a wide edge over Davis as a war leader, and in Grant and Sherman, the North acquired commanders with the concept of total war and the necessary determination to make it happen. And later, in a book specifically on total war, not only for the Confederate or for the Civil War, but also for the wars of German reunification, quoted much here, McPherson said the Civil War had elements of total war, so he's a little softening of his view. The destruction of Southern property in Civil War eliminated resources and the people's will to keep fighting. Sherman's destructiveness of his army and his campaigns was less than, say, the World War II bombers, but the strategic purpose of both were the same, to eliminate the resources and break the will of the people to sustain war. John Marszalek again blamed Sherman in 1989. Total war was first done by Sherman. And finally, Edward Hagerman, in the Road on the Road to Total War book by Stig Foster and Jörg Nagler, said, again, the Civil War induced modern total war. First time politicians and generals organized the total human and material resources of a mass industrial society for war and turned them to the total destruction of the resources as well as the social and political system of another society. And he noted that as the first time that Karl von Clausewitz's view on total war and war in general, it was the first time modern nationalism on the backs of citizen armies with modern technology of the Industrial Revolution increased or intensified the totality of the war. So we have several people, several esteemed historians saying the war was the first total war. But on the other hand, we have many who said it didn't. You got Bruce Catton who just said total war, but in 1960 he said the soldiers, generals, even company commanders believed in a hard war. They saw slavery and the Southerners as the cause of the war, and thus they were justified in their hard war on the civilians and the Southern economy. James McPherson, which we saw three times, said total war, said in Battle Cry of Freedom also, with Sheridan's and Sherman's campaigns, it was a hard war and would soon become harder. So he's playing both sides of it. Mark Grimsley, in 1995, said there were 3 stages of the war, and he focused quite a bit on the western side. He said there's conciliation, where they weren't going to hurt the Southern people. They figured most of them weren't secessionists, and they wanted to get them back. Pragmatic period, which is what we're studying here, July of 62 to January of 64, said there was pragmatic use of the hard war. And then finally, after February of 1864, it was a hard war. Grimsley says the Union policy towards non-combatants always had little strategic purpose initially during the middle study we're talking today. They sought victory on the battlefield. They would forage and take from the civilians what they needed to succeed on the battlefield, succeed in the operations against the Confederate armies. They retaliated against guerrillas and those that supported them, but it was done in order to achieve victory. And they treated the Southerners in different ways. They were harsh on the overt secessionists, but on the Unionists, they helped them, and they left alone the people that were neutral. Grimsley says, in the Civil War, you do not see the extensive mobilization of manpower and resources for destructive acts on economic resources that you normally see attributed in total war. And that the federal strategy during the war had extensive continuity with practices from wars in the past. Another work on the emergence of total wars in 1996 by a collection of authors noted with editors Robert Doughty and Ira Gruber, yes, they sought to wear down the Confederate economy by attrition, exhaust the South. But key here is they said the war came closer than any war in the 19th century to total war. Closer, but not total war. Stig Forster and Jörg Nagler, in their preface to On the Road to Total War in 1997, said that, again, the seeds of total war can be traced to the American Civil War. Richard Behringer, in the same work, said there was not 100% unity in the Confederacy. Not everyone considered themselves a Confederate. Thus, this Confederacy lacked the nationalistic identification usually associated with total war. Behringer says it wasn't a total war, but approached it in its effect on the Southern civilian population. Just a few more. Earl Hess, in the same work, said yes, militarily had a lot of the same total war aspects of later wars, but behind the war, especially in the North, you did not see totality of total war. Mark Neely, prominent in this view, and where my initial description of what hard war was, he says, any assessment of the Civil War, nearness to being a total war, can be no more than that, an assertion that has approached total war in some ways. By no definition of the term can it be said the Civil War was a total war. And essential to his view of this is that any definition of total war asserts that it breaks down the distinction between soldiers and civilians, combatants and non-combatants. And this, in no way did this happen in the Civil War systematically, even by Sherman. He also added these comments in a later article, and he says, hey, the dictionary says total war, every citizen is in a sense a combatant, and this did not happen. He states that most students of Sherman said he fought in a 19th century manner, no systematic cruelty to civilians, and abuse towards women practically was unknown. On the march through Georgia to Savannah and then up through the Carolinas, he did not destroy all the war-making industry that was available to be destroyed. For instance, he bypassed Augusta, Georgia. It had war-making facilities. He did not destroy them. His goal was to show the South that he can march an army and they can't defeat him. Yes, he destroyed rail lines. Yes, they foraged, and some people did burn houses, and some men, but it was not systematic. And again, Neely says, it cannot be a total war because the civilians were not considered legitimate military targets. And finally, Wayne Ciano Isai, in 2011, the latest to bring this in, speaks against associating unconditional surrender with total war, but he agrees with Neely. There was a line between civilians and soldiers. The men's religious scruples and the effective control by civilian leaders prevented the war from becoming truly total. Yes, it was the most destructive war in America's history, but it was clear that the war was not a break from Western history, especially in the military side, an era of limited to total war. It had links to both, limited and total war, but it was not a total war. So let's move on. Let's look at the 45th Illinois and their experience during the first part of the war. Answering the call. The regiment came into existence on July 24th in Galena, Illinois by Colonel John E. Smith. The regiment was one answer to Lincoln's call on July 22nd after the debacle at Battle Run for 500,000 men to restore the Union. Most of the men, over 90%, came from 11 northern counties in Illinois. They were, of course, called the Washburn Lead Mine Regiment, as noted, because Congressman E.B. Washburn, a close confidant of Lincoln and a staunch proponent of Grant, living in Galena, of course, before the war, secured Enfield rifles and top-of-the-line equipment for the regiment. There were only one of 5 regiments that started in 1861 to get these Enfield rifles. They're also, so they named themselves the Washburn, after Washburn led E.B. Washburn, but they also were known as the Lead Mine Regiment because Galena was known for its iron ore production. At one point in 1920s, they were richer than everybody in Chicago. So they were known for iron ore, they were done for miners, and you will see that this will help them later in the Vicksburg campaign. So 6 companies were drilling in Galena from July to November and were shipped to Camp Douglas in Chicago, Illinois, not far from the wigwam where Lincoln was nominated in 1860, to finish their training. Soldiering can be tough, even not in battle. They're married up with 4 other companies from the northern part of Illinois. And they spent the winter in Chicago. Life was tough. Drafty barracks, inches between planks of wood for their barracks. They were cold, it was drafty. They were close quarters with thousands of men. And in many wars, just like in the Civil War, the men suffered from exposure, sickness. Many died. Many were discharged because of sickness from measles, mumps, scarlet fever. But they drilled religiously and with stiff discipline departed on January 15, 1862 for Cairo, Illinois, and to join the war. They spent 2 weeks in Cairo, and while Cairo was warmer, it wasn't much better. Incessant rains turned the camp into mud, and many men longed to actually fight and get out of Cairo. Off to war. Foraging would not be tolerated. On February 2nd, 1862, they left with Grant's forces on Grant's mission to capture the Confederate forts Fort Henry and Donelson. As we see here, it's kind of hard to see, but Fort Henry and Donelson are right kind of where Kentucky kind of takes a 90-degree down and to the left there, right on 2 major rivers, Fort Henry on Tennessee and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. And you'll see that Cumberland goes straight to Nashville, very critical in the west to secure Nashville. And the Tennessee goes all the way through Tennessee and into Alabama. It's another pathway to the heart of the Western Confederacy. On their way down the war, the reason I say foraging would not be tolerated is the men were punished, some, for stealing whiskey when their ships stopped to get wood for their boilers. Very ingenious. There's a barrel of whiskey. They got underneath the wood planking of the building, drilled holes through the barrel, and started drinking all the whiskey. They were punished, these pilferers, just for stealing whiskey. It'll be laughable later. On the way to Fort Henry, they were under strict orders to not pillage, to not take civilian property. One civilian even received a guard to protect his land. However, this did not stop the men from stealing a farm's errant goose, and they took great lengths to hide the fact that they captured a Confederate pig for their meals from the officers. They were scared, actually, of being caught with the pig. Their march to Fort Henry was anticlimactic as the Navy secured the fort before they got there. So they move on. Who needs a coat? Seeing the elephant. Seeing the elephant was a term of the men down there in many wars of seeing combat for the first time. So they march to Fort Donelson, and they're wearing their heavy coats and their packs, and it's hot. So they take their coats off. Who needs them? Unfortunately, later that day and into a few days before the battle started, they're in the line with no coats, few blankets, they're cold. The glory of fighting in a war. So they attack Fort Donelson, and they're attacked themselves. And while they escaped much injury, only few killed and 20 wounded, their fellow regiments suffered much worse. Unfortunately, in the Civil War, just because you didn't lose too many men, you didn't have to escape the gore of combat, as they were assigned burial duty to the horribly mangled dead all around them. However, their service during this battle gained them a reputation of one of the most disciplined and bravest of the Union regiments. Next came Shiloh. They got to Shiloh, or they got to Pittsburgh Landing on March 13th. Spent 3 weeks there before the battle started. And they did their first real foraging. However, this was authorized foraging. One company of the regiment with the cavalry unit went down and successfully captured 50,000 pounds of bacon that was obviously intended for either the civilians or the soldiers in the area. This was authorized foraging, different than what you'll see later. During the battle on April 6th and 7th, The 45th Illinois went into battle with 562 men. They started with 927 just a few months before. Most of the men, again, lost from disease and sickness. Serving in the military during this war, most men died of health reasons, sickness, disease, not in battle. But the reputation of Fort Donelson was held up. They fought bravely when they were surprised. They fought with a forced retreat because the Confederates kept flanking them. But they didn't panic even when they lost ammunition, and they even counterattacked at one point during the day. But they ended the day, April 6th, in the precarious defensive perimeter that Grant had near the river, near the Tennessee River. They couldn't get rest that night. They knew they were going to attack the next day, but the groans and cries of the wounded prevented much sleep. These cries and groans, one man relived 50 years later, haunted for the rest of his life. Despite the victorious counterattack by Grant on April 7th, there was little celebration as they and their fellow comrades had to perform the gruesome work of burying the decaying corpses of both armies, and worse yet, the hauling of dead horses and the burning of thousands of pounds of horses. This is the worst yet. This was the most, 10,000 casualties. The work was gruesome. One soldier said he couldn't have gotten through it without the liberally supplied whiskey that the officers gave them. The toll on the regiment. One company of 55 men lost almost half, 24 casualties. Total for a regiment that came into battle at 562 men, they lost 23 dead, 187 wounded, and 3 missing, or 38% of the regiment gone. And in records, studying the records of the men and the results of their service, few of the 187 men ever returned. The impact of Halleck, Henry Halleck, general and commander of the Western War at the time, march and dig. So Halleck took over from Grant after the battle, and they proceeded to go to Corinth, which was, on that previous slide, was a critical railroad junction. But Halleck said he wasn't going to be surprised, so they marched. They dug fortifications, marched, dug fortifications. They weren't going to be surprised like at Shiloh. But he failed in his goal to destroy the Confederate Western Army. His goal was to win territory, an antiquated view of the war, and which obviously hurt many generals in the war. So he broke up the army in western Tennessee, and the 45th Illinois went to Jackson, Tennessee, to guard the Mississippi Central Rail Line, which was a key supply line for the Union men. Life on guard of this railroad wasn't great. They're under threat of constant attack by Confederate cavalry. Even one county got captured and was captured and was a prisoner of war for 4 months during one short battle. However, the regiment began to forage liberally on corn, peaches, plums, blackberries. They consumed chickens and geese that somehow made it into their camp. During this time, it was the first time that the regiment received hatred from the Southern civilians. These civilians believed the stories they were told that Union men would commit atrocities on them. So they immediately hated them, even though the regiment never committed true atrocities. Yes, they foraged and took food and fruit and chickens, what they needed, but they didn't commit any atrocities against the civilians. The local slaves distrusted them. They believed that their masters, that the Union men would ship them off to Africa. So they're in a hostile territory. They have these people that they have, in some cases, didn't do anything against them, but yet they're receiving this hatred. So the Vicksburg campaign. The regiment stayed in Jackson for approximately 4 months, from August of 1862 to early December of 62. Here you see the detonation of the mine below Fort Hill. And if you've been to Vicksburg, you can clearly see where Fort Hill was. It was also called the 3rd Louisiana Redan. And the miners from Galena helped to build this mine. Not as famous as the crater in the St. Petersburg operations against those siege, but as you'll see, just as fruitless as a means to break through. So here we see the path to hard war, and not blame, it's too much hard of a word, but Halleck and Grant for creating the concept of the hard war. First we see in August of 1862, Halleck to Grant, "It is very desirable that you should clean out West Tennessee and northern Mississippi of all organized enemies. If necessary, take up all active sympathizers and either hold them as prisoners or put them behind your lines. Handle the class without gloves and take their property for public use. As soon as the corn gets fit for forage, get all supplies you can from the rebels in Mississippi. It is time they should begin to feel the presence of war on our side and see that all possible facilities are afforded for getting our cotton. It is deemed important to get as much as we can to market, and it's okay to pay gold for that cotton." So they wanted to take the means of the Confederate government of selling cotton to raise money for their war effort and giving it to possible Southerners who were either true businessmen and didn't care about the war and the Confederacy. They just wanted the money. So Halleck is granting them to take the gloves off. As noted, there was a conciliatory period where they weren't allowed to forage, and that was done by the commanders. Here, the leader now moved to Washington, D.C. He's telling Grant to do it. Grant, in his memoirs, said, Shiloh was the turning point. Before that, myself and others, most people in the government, thought the Confederacy would collapse after a few losses. But he said, hey, we took 21,000 men at Fort Donelson. We captured all these fortresses along the river in Kentucky, Tennessee, and they still brought war to us. They attacked us and almost succeeded at Shiloh. So he says after Shiloh, he gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. He said the policy of the Army up until then was to protect the property of the citizens. After, however, he regarded it was humane to both sides to protect the persons of those that found at their homes, but to consume everything that could be used to support or supply armies. So he's converted to this hard war view. And he issues one of his general orders right before he starts on his first attempt to capture Vicksburg. He says, people not actively engaged in rebellion should not be allowed to suffer from hunger in reach of a country abounding with supplies. This government, never the cause of the state of affairs, starting the Civil War, should not be subjected to the burden of furnishing the necessary relief, but the weight should fall on those that act, encourage, and have sympathies for the Confederate position. He ordered necessary expenses for the relief needed to be borne by sympathizers of the rebellion. His district commanders were in charge of handing out this relief, as well as going to the known disloyal Confederates and assessing a portion of their relative ability to pay, this money going to people that were needing food but were not for the Confederacy. So Grant attempts to go down the land route from Memphis down to Vicksburg. And until this time, wide-scale foraging had not happened, and it had not been directed by the commanders. So his North Mississippi Central campaign, because it was going down the Mississippi Central Railroad, foraging became a necessity, as we'll see. To Grant, his men successfully foraged and fed themselves during this campaign after his main supply base at Holly Springs had been destroyed by Confederate cavalry. When civilians complained, Grant said, hey, don't blame me. It's your military that destroyed my supplies. And Grant punished men who did not forage as he instructed. When men foraged, they were instructed to give receipts to the Southerners that would be paid by the Army. And he also imprisoned men who burned down houses of some of the Southerners. The 45th Illinois joined this campaign on November 2nd. They left Jackson, Tennessee. On their way, they saw mostly deserted plantations with aging slaves. The productive slaves and their masters fled the approach of the Army. The 45th Illinois reached Coffeyville, Mississippi on December 11th. They stayed for 10 days, but were ordered back north after Holly Springs was destroyed, the supply base. Because of the so there's a tough war. tough winter heading their way. So on their way back, they suffered much deprivation way back north to Jackson. While Grant said his Army's foraging amply provided for his men, the men of the 45th Illinois would kindly disagree. The men marched on scarce rations and had to forage just to survive. They celebrated Christmas in 1862 with no food. On January 5th, 1863, on half rations, they'd been on half rations for 10 days. With few rations, the men collected corn from the surrounding fields. Of course, this hurt the civilians who were relying on the corn for food, but unfortunately the corn did not last. 2 days later, on January 7th, after a 20-mile march, the men went to bed hungry. They had simply nothing to eat. Their suffering continued. They spent much of the last half of January without rations, and many of the men had endured the bitter cold with no shoes. They reached Memphis on the 21st of January, 1863, after a 25-mile march, all on empty stomachs. They were in Memphis for a month, and despite their deprivation, the Inspector General of the 17th Corps rated the regiment the best in the 3rd Division because of their discipline and the condition of their camp, uniforms, weapons, and gear. So we see a regiment that would not have foraged, obviously, if they had supplies, but due to the necessities of war, foraged, and obviously hurt the civilians in their retreat back north. They were foraging on their own. They didn't have any guard. The officers didn't care. They had to get the food. But they left Memphis on February 22nd on their second leg of participation in the Vicksburg campaign. Their destination was Lake Providence, Louisiana. If you see a map of Louisiana near south of Memphis, you'll see this fairly large lake protected from the river by a levee. Their goal was to break these levees and to flood the bayous in Louisiana to allow ships to move, Union ships to move down to the Red River, up the Mississippi, and attack Vicksburg from the south. Grant's whole goal is to get beyond Vicksburg. He knew he couldn't go over land because of the supply situation. He had to get down south of Vicksburg and move north. So they moved with the rest of their comrades in the 17th Corps, Major General James B. McPherson commanding. And they started to work on the levees. Here, however, they saw rich plantations with rich crops, but devoid of any men. The white men were all fighting the war. The slaves had run to the Union lines, further depriving the Southerners and making their life harder. They didn't have their slaves to do the work. Here, you see the men beginning to blame the Confederates for starting the war, and because of their love of slavery. Many began to see Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation as in a positive note, which was a change in their original views. They saw it as a way to hurt the Confederates. Their hardened views towards the Confederate people, again, because they were making them suffer in hardships during the war, and they had started the war. Here we see Bruce Cann's assertion that in seeing slavery for the first time, the men held the Southerners in slavery for causing the war. This again justified their hard war on the Southerners. So the men worked with their comrades. They knew that flooding the bayous and flooding these farms south and west of the lake would cause millions of dollars of damage to not only the plantations and the crops, but to property. They knew it would hurt the Confederacy's war effort. So they completed their work on March 15th. They had broken open the levee that protected the swamps and the farms downstream from the lake. They left, they got on the Mississippi River. Other men who had been working on the levee to make the Mississippi River flow into the lake and then flood more of the bayou, that was broken. And they see the flooding, and they don't care. Other men from other units decided to break Grant's orders to not pillage private property, as far as setting on fire, destroying houses, by setting fire to a nearby church. Major Luther Cowan regretted the firing of a fine building, he said, but he took no action against the men, and neither did any other Union officer. Cowan believed in firing this building and other buildings that they came across that the war would come closer to an end. Slaves nearby smiled as the church burned, while glum-looking white civilians looked on. It can be said that the attitude of the officers during the war and during this period contributed to their men's wanton acts of destruction. It was okay with their officers, they were going to destroy property and hurt the civilians. Many of the slaves watching the firing of the building decided to leave their masters, further adding to the suffering of the Southern civilians. Unfortunately, this plan did not work. It failed to provide the necessary pathway via water for Grant's army. Thus, they left on April 19th for Milliken's Bend, Louisiana. Grant's successful bypass of Vicksburg to the siege of Vicksburg. So Grant planned to send his men down the western bank of the Mississippi River in Louisiana, but he also had to send supply ships down past the Vicksburg defenses. This hadn't been tried. People thought he was nuts. But he needed men to serve on these ships from the different units. Most of the regiment raised their hands again. 9 men were selected, while the rest of the army began their trek down to southern Louisiana and into Mississippi. The 70-mile march was very hard on the men. They suffered from severe heat and suffered worse because there was a lack of good water. The water they found in ponds and swamps actually made them sicker and made it worse. However, they deliberately foraged along these fine plantations they came across, and they had plenty to eat at this point. They used wood from houses and fences for their fires and for their shelter from the elements. Disgusted secessionists destroyed their own property. For example, one man taunted the men of the 45th Illinois, saying that all the Union ships that tried to make their run past Vicksburg were destroyed. However, the men of the 45th had the last laugh and taunted the man when they learned of the successful mission. The man stormed off angrily and burned his own house, rather let the Union soldiers use it for wood and for shelter. So the men make it down, and they're about to cross over to Mississippi, and Grant makes his epic decision that his army was going to live off the land. The orders were for all Union men to leave their knapsacks and baggage on the Louisiana side of the river and only take 3 days rations and 40 rounds of ammunition. They were going to live off the land until they got to Vicksburg. So they cross on the 30th of April, and the first battle, Port Gibson, happened on May 1st. The men of the 45th rushed 12 miles to battle, all on empty stomachs because their ship carrying their rations had sunk. The men of the 45th Illinois were proud of their actions during this battle. They marched 90 miles in 8 days to get to the battle, all on short rations, bad water, through heat, rain, mud, and dust, while having to forage to provide enough food to carry on, all with few men falling out of line, sick or disabled. They entered the battle on empty stomachs and quitted their cells as they had in previous battles. They next made a tough march to Raymond, and their foraging became greater. With their sister regiments, they secured over 7,000 pounds of bacon that was in the house of a Confederate colonel. Bacon obviously either aimed at supplying the civilians with food or the men that would be hemmed in during the siege of Vicksburg. It came at a needed time because they had few rations left. Of course, the impact on Southerners is unknown, but could not have been good. But they did help the Southerners in the area by fixing a bridge that would have been burned by the retreating Confederates, so they weren't all bad. On their final march to Jackson and the Battle of Champion Hill and on to the siege of Vicksburg, these marches were made in choking dust with little water, and for at least a third of the men, no shoes. While usually receiving less than 3/4 of their daily rations, and despite the additional rations brought up from Grand Gulf, many of the men had to forage just to get enough food to eat. Here, Major Luther Cowan sees a complete change in his men. For the first time, the men no longer cared of what the impact of their actions were on the Southerners. They didn't care about the slaves leaving the masters, and they didn't even try. At early parts of the war, they were told to return the slaves to their masters, no longer. They enjoyed taking food from the old secesh and loved hearing them beg to be left alone. Of course, these men's views only made it harder on the Southerners. After a brief yet intense battle at Raymond, they marched to Jackson, and with more rampant foraging. The men of the regiment did not join General William Tecumseh Sherman's 15th Corps in pillaging of Jackson. Why? For pious reasons? No. They feared coming close to a nearby smallpox hospital. So they had some logical reasonings for not pillaging. The men went to bed near Jackson with little rations and with many men without shoes, and almost all of them without blankets. Yet they were in high spirits. They were proud of their accomplishments. On May 16th, the Battle of Champion Hill, the largest battle in the campaign, then the men with the rest of their mates in the 3rd Division of the 17th Corps attacked up Champion Hill. Surprisingly, the regiment lost few men, especially compared to their fellow regiments. Unfortunately, these casualties hit their color guard hard, as all were killed or wounded. The regimental colors was riddled with bullets, showing the ferocity of the battle. As with Shiloh, as with Donelson, the horrors they may not have experienced in many dead came later in having to help the wounded to the surgeons and bury the dead. Like I said, it was the largest battle of the Vicksburg campaign, and the scale of horror that the men saw post-battle they hadn't seen since Shiloh. And for Sergeant William Crummer, these horrors were remembered the rest of his life. All around them were dead, dying, and wounded, and the incessant groans and cries of the wounded. They helped Union surgeons carry the wounded, and they appropriated every barn, house they could find for the wounded and for the grisly work of the surgeons. The men picked up rebel wounded as well. Rebels were not treated any differently than Union. They got help by the surgeons as fast as possible. To Crummer, the wounded were the real heroes, having to survive their limbs being cut off with no anesthetic. After the wounded were taken care of, the grisly act of burying the bodies began, and they impressed rebel prisoners to help in this act. So on to the siege of Vicksburg. I think we're still good. The siege, the longest siege in U.S. history on U.S. land. The siege would cost the regiment most of its senior commanders, and it became the greatest test of the men during the campaign. But yet they also earned the greatest honor as well. They missed the first assault on May 19th because of the work at the Champion Hill battlefield. But on May 22nd was the second major assault and the last major assault by Grant to break through the siege lines. Our Major Cowan unfortunately died within the first 15 seconds of the attack. The attack failed and the long siege began. The work by the men was either in the rifle pits, sniper duty, or digging the approach or sap to the Fort Hill for the mine, or resting in camp. The greatest danger during this time was the Confederate sniper fire, where death and wounds continued. However, the men had one luxury they hadn't had in almost a month: ample food supply. Supplies easily reached the men at Vicksburg because of the defeat of most of the fortress. Unfortunately, this food was only standard Army fare: salt pork, bacon, and hardtack bread. They didn't care. They had food, and they didn't have to worry about the uneven results of foraging. Men like Crummer no longer have to resort to eating spare rinds of dirty bacon they found on the side of the road to soothe their gnawing hunger. This hunger Crummer remembered just like the horrors of the battlefields for 50 years. However, after a period of time, the Confederate sniper fire failed to faze the men or the shells from the Confederate artillery. A death of a fellow soldier only brought the question of who would be next. Of course, their toughest duty was again digging the approach to the Fort Hill. As the SAP approached the Confederate lines, good-natured conversation between combatants ensued. The men found that their hunger was not as bad as the men on the Confederate lines. On June 25th, the mine was ready to be detonated. The miners from Galena, along with their fellow soldiers, put 2,200 pounds of black powder underneath the Confederate lines. General Logan, the commander of the 3rd Division of the 17th Corps, asked his old regiment, the 31st Illinois, if they wanted to lead the attack. They refused. He went to the 45th Illinois, he said, with forlorn hope, and asked them, "I come to the 45th, who, I'm satisfied, never refused anything that I asked them. All the boys who are willing to go, hold up their hands." The entire regiment did so. Not all welcomed the mission, however. One man feared being called a coward more, however. "I will be a coward not to go, and it would hurt my mother more than to hear this than if I was brought home dead." The fighting lasted over 24 hours. To the men, it was the longest 2 days of the campaign. At 4:30 p.m., the mine under Fort Hill was exploded. To the men, the mine explosion made a frightful noise. It shook the ground. It sent body parts of dead rebel soldiers into the air and buried other dead rebels that would not be found until years later. However, there was one lucky slave that was blown clear from the rebel lines to the Union lines. A very lucky man. The explosion created a saucer-shaped crater that replaced the A-shaped fort. Now, think of an A-shaped fort pointing out towards the Union lines. However, the crater could only hold 60 to 80 men at a time. Thus, whole regiments couldn't fight. They had to fight in groups of 10 and keep getting replaced. This obviously was one of the reasons it prevented the breakthrough that the Union commanders wanted. Another problem, unbeknownst to the Union commanders, that the rebels had built a second line of fortifications. The mine explosion only destroyed a section of the first line, not the second line. So the men fought. They were the first ones into the crater, and they were succeeded by men from other regiments in their brigade. On the dawn of the 26th, the men re-entered the crater and fought until 10 a.m. As the men prepared to re-enter the battle, their division commander, Logan, despaired. "My God, they're killing my bravest men." When asked why the fight couldn't be stopped, Logan said, "I can't. My commanding officer orders me to hold every inch of ground." His commander, Major General James McPherson, finally called off the fighting in the late afternoon of May 26th. The men who were very fond of Grant, especially the men from Galena, and very fond of McPherson, however, criticized both generals and never forgave them for letting the battle go on so long. However, deprivation by civilians and soldiers within Vicksburg eventually led to General Pemberton, the commander of the Confederate forces, to ask for surrender on July 4th. As noted, the crater attack decimated the regiment's leadership. Colonel Jasper A. Maltby suffered a terrible wound to his face. His executive officer, Major Millicon Smith, was hit in the head by 3 mini-balls and died later. Before he died, he said, "I die as a true soldier, as I would wish to die." Third in command, Leander B. Fisk, who was promoted to replace the dead Cowan, continued to fight on May 24th after being shot twice. Unfortunately, the third bullet killed him. Overall, for a regiment that had fewer than 300 men starting the siege, they lost 7 men killed and 61 wounded, 23% of the regiment. Our William Crummer survived both trips to the crater. Unfortunately, later, before the surrender, he was hit in the lungs by a Confederate bullet and was given no treatment for 4 days. The doctors assumed he would die, and it wasn't worth their time. He survived and would live into the 1920s as the leader of the 45th Regiment's veterans and helped the military park commander at Vicksburg locate the regiment's monuments and tell them what happened to their men during this battle. Their division commander Logan and Corps commander McPherson and on to Grant. Logan requested that the regiment lead the army into the captured city. McPherson agreed, passed it to Grant, and Grant agreed. So they were the first unit to enter the city. They led the army in, and their regimental flag, tattered from the battles, was the first Union flag to fly over Vicksburg in over 2 years. To McPherson, the 45th Illinois had borne the brunt of the battle oftener than any other in my command, and always behaved nobly. The men of the regiment saw the deprivation of both the civilians and soldiers within Vicksburg. There were dead and dying wounded soldiers everywhere, an appalling sight. Cut off or blown off limbs lay everywhere. Blood stained the ground red, and the moans and groans of those still alive were heard everywhere. Were the Union men have hatred of their fellow soldiers on the opposite side? No. They gave the grateful men from the Confederacy who had just surrendered hardtack, the bread, and bacon in return for information on the Confederate losses, the experiences in the trenches, and their roles as sharpshooters. Men on both sides expressed a wish that the war would be over soon, that they could get and live together in peace. These jovial rebel soldiers, however, became quickly dejected and left the city silently as they were forced to leave, leave the city, which was the conditions of their parole by Grant. Here we see two pictures of the time of the regiment during the siege. On the left is the sap, and you see the thin tunnel going up to the crater. This is after the crater exploded. You see kind of saucer shape. The picture on the right is the Shirley House, and if you go to Vicksburg, you can see today it's been restored. And what you see is the back hill behind on the east side of the siege lines. That's where the men built their shelter into the hill to escape the shells and the bullets. So the men were done with Vicksburg. They were heroes, place of honor. They stayed in Vicksburg for several months afterwards on guard, and they took part in some minor events, minor battles and missions. 68% of the men re-enlisted in late December of '63 and January of '64. As such, as they were over the 50% mark, they became veterans and got to keep their regiment whole. They then took part in Sherman's Meridian Campaign. This campaign by Sherman was essentially his test of his way of war and how he would implement it in Georgia and the Carolinas. Two men, unfortunately, whereas not too many died in their Union Army, in Sherman's army, unfortunately 2 men were captured and would die in the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia. They next moved to the Atlanta campaign after having 1 month furlough because they had re-enlisted. Unfortunately, to some men, they did not serve with the rest of their brigade in the capture of Atlanta. Instead, they guarded 2 bridges during this period, a role that had to be fulfilled by somebody in order for Sherman to get the supplies for his army. But they suffered still, and many were always sick during this campaign. They did engage in some short, sharp battles with Confederate cavalry, so life was not a picnic on guard duty. Then they got selected to be one of Sherman's bummers, the March to the Sea, where foraging became more liberal than before. They walked many miles, and many without shoes, and yet with the foraging still not well fed. They then marched in the Carolinas campaign for Sherman, and although they did not witness the destruction of Columbia, the home of secession, they did not express any shame or worry over the Southern civilians in the town. They didn't experience much battle during this time, and few died and few were wounded. However, due to competition among the commanders of the regiments, they had to make a hard, brutal race to D.C. who would get there first. And many suffered, again, without shoes. With their Western comrades, they took part in the Washington Review the day after the Army of Potomac, and they considered them shiny Eastern men. They were proud of their rough look and proud of their uniforms that were tatters. They were proud to serve. They were discharged in Louisville, Kentucky on July 12, 1865, and took trains and boats back to Illinois, to home. After the war, many men survived into the 1920s, and their original commander, Johnny Smith, served in the regular army until his retirement. So what could be said of the Vicksburg campaign and the 45th Illinois? I propose that the experience of the 45th Illinois demonstrated Grimsley's pragmatic and later hard war period of the war. This hard war was driven from the top by Halleck and Grant and Sherman. Civilians weren't hurt physically, and most of their houses weren't destroyed. But the men took what they needed to survive and to take away from the Confederate Army: supplies, munitions, factories. They foraged when they needed. And yes, the civilians were negatively impacted by their presence. But they didn't treat all Southerners the same. When they met Unionists like the Shirley House in Vicksburg, they came to agreement with the Confederates to not send any shells into the house. And here we see a hard war, not a total war. There was not extensive mobilization by the Union Army to use manpower and resources for attacks on the economic capabilities of the South or the civilians. Yes, they were hurt. Yes, factories are burned and munitions and food taken. But it was done by the regular army as part of their service during the war. It was not done by individuals enlisted just to take impact on the Southerners. And it's very clear that when the war became hard on the Union men on the 45th Illinois, then in turn it became hard on the Southern civilians. And Grant's directions not to hurt the houses or physically hurt the civilians did go unpunished when the men performed these acts. The officers did not care. It was going to help the war end early. And I contend that the war in the West, not in battle, but the war in the West, marching, having to forage for food, living off the land, with many without shoes, in the cold or heat, was harder than that in the East. The men in the East had many more battles, and the battles were just as fierce as any battles in the war. However, they had a very short supply line to Washington, D.C. They never want for food, or in general not. Of course, sometimes that happened. But in general, I propose that these men were brave, hard men at the end of the war, and suffered greatly for the service of their country. And here I agree with Canton that the men justified this hard war, again because of exposure to slavery and the hard attitude towards the Southerners and back at them. They experienced the first time the hatred of the civilians, all because the civilians presumed that they would commit atrocities. They believed in Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation as another way to hurt the Confederacy. Major Cowan echoed many of the officers in that the destruction of the property owned by Confederates would end the war sooner. The Confederates had started the war and thus deserved all that came to them. The men were also angry at the Copperheads, the anti-war, mostly Democrats back in the North. While they were being asked to endure greater and greater sacrifice for their country, difficult marches, difficult conditions, while serving on minimal rations at times. The men took their anger out on the Southerners. They had nowhere else to go with the anger. Interesting here is that this anger did not extend to the people that were trying to kill them, the Confederate soldiers. Repeatedly, you see kinship shared between the rebel soldiers and the Union men, a camaraderie born from the great sacrifices both groups of men made during the war. Thank you. Is that too long? All right, good. Any questions? Their main goal was to destroy two levees, one from the river into the lake, the Mississippi River into the lake, and then from the lake into the bayou. So first they destroyed the levee that took the water from the lake into the bayous, and then other men, they got back out to the Mississippi River. Other men, they destroyed the levees, and thus the Mississippi River flows into the lake, into the bayous, and they wanted to raise the water level up to let the Union ships go down through the bayou, and eventually, yes, they did. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting to see who put up those markers and who did their research. Right. Well, it was one of, I believe, 7 attempts by Grant to get beyond the Vicksburg batteries, or 6, and he succeeded finally on the 7th. So and he tried a couple other times to go down through the bayous on the eastern side, on the Mississippi side, Tennessee side, but those all failed as well. So it's interesting. I think today maybe somebody wouldn't think that just because, you know, bayous aren't very predictable, and try to take a ship down a bayou. Yeah. It's an interesting time. Anybody else?
I've got it. Go ahead.
Okay.
You said the 40 field was armed with some kind of new rifle or something?
Well, they were armed with the short Enfield rifles. The Enfield was a British rifle, still musket loading, you know, but it was a rifle. The other ones were the Springfield rifles that were produced in Massachusetts. They were very similar in caliber, very big caliber, over ½ an inch, like .58 caliber weapons. One of the reasons that so many men never came back after being wounded in war is because usually the bullet would hit either obviously hit a major organ, or it would hit their legs, arms, and because the muzzle velocity wasn't very big, that big bullet would hit your bones and shatter it and had to be amputated. So they were short Enfields, not as long as, obviously there was a longer variety. But again, very few people across, especially at the start of the war, Union and Confederates, many of them fought the whole war without a rifle. They had the old muzzle-loading smoothbore muskets. Even in the Atlanta campaign, they had many men that didn't have the modern rifles.
Yeah, my question was, obviously you think of this as an example of a hard war versus total war.
Yes.
Do you think that this stands out as an individual example, or is it evidence of a more general trend in the West?
What I've studied as far as the war in the West, I would say that it's a general trend, because you never saw, yes, they foraged, and yes, they would blow up factories. But for instance, the Union Army had been blamed for the destruction of Atlanta. And yes, they blew up some stuff as they left Atlanta. They blew up war-making facilities and other means for the Confederates to come back in and use those. But debated, many of the Confederates, when they were leaving and evacuating the city, blew up and started fires. And in Columbia, it's a big debate whether the Union men started the fires that destroyed Columbia. And in many cases, there's enough evidence that says no. Some of the Southern soldiers were leaving and did the same thing as in Atlanta. They destroyed munitions and other supplies that the Union men would want. So a lot of debate there. I think, the way I look at it, you didn't see of course, there was instances of rape and instances of destruction of people's houses, as I've noted, but you didn't see that pure, just I'm just going to go and destroy every house. Did Major Cowan and his men destroy every house they saw? No. Although he said, you know, it could go towards winning the war. So I would like to say that, you know, there are humans, and humans can do bad things in war, but they did it to win the war. They did it to survive as far as rations and to destroy the war-making capabilities of the Confederacy. Yes, ma'am.
So would you consider like Iraq or Afghanistan, where the two places a hard war now instead of total war?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't. And the one thing that the historians talk about the total war is that, for instance, in the Vietnam War, it was not a total war for the United States, right? Many people back here were totally unaffected by the war. But for the Vietnamese, it was one of the shining examples of what a true total war. They used everything they could to defeat the U.S. and the South Vietnamese. I would say that in Afghanistan, you know, the Islamic terrorists and the fighting against the, you know, the U.S. forces is probably much more of a total war than, again, for us, right? So few people are over there compared to the rest. We're not all impacted. We're not rationing food. I would say World War II was probably worse in many wars as far as rationing and having to, you know, scrap metal and women having to work instead of the men. In the Civil War, I side with the men, with the historians that say, you know, in the North there was no rationing. They always had plenty of food. If it was a total war, they would have had to ration food. And also many men didn't serve. You know, a lot less men served as percentage of military age in the North than in the South. But I would say in the South, while there may not have been rationing, it was a much more total war. You know, they lost, I can't remember the number, it's like 1 in 4 men were lost during the war was it 18 to 50?
Yeah,
I mean, 1 in 4, that's pretty large number, and impacted the South for very long.
and actually, new studies are showing that the total number of dead, we always thought as historians that it was a lowball number. The range had been, for the Civil War, 620,000 to 680,000. But now historians are going back and saying that it was probably somewhere between 750,000 to a million. As accurate totals, going back and looking at census data and rolls
Right.
of service.
Yeah.
So it was definitely impactful, especially when you think about 90% of Southern men who are drafted in just because of the lack of population.
Right.
You got 22 million roughly in the North versus 9 million in the South, 3.5 of that being African American enslaved people. So 22, 24 million versus about 6 million.
Yeah.
The numbers are one-sided definitely.
Yep. Again, I would say, you know, when you say total war, was a total for both sides? Again, for the Union, no, it wasn't a total war. Was it a major effort? Sure. And much larger effort than almost every war, maybe except World War II, as far as production and war material. But in the South, very much closer to a total war. So I kind of see it from two sides. But again, if you're looking at the intent of the Union Army and the commanders and how they fought the war, I don't see, and in everything I've read, you don't, like, for instance, Sherman, one of the authors who was defending Sherman, said if you read his whole entire words on the war, yes, he said you have to make the war hard, right? But the only time he became pretty brutal with Confederate capture, POWs, is when his own men were being killed by the mines on the roads in South Carolina, or Georgia, South Carolina. He considered that, you know, not proper in war to surprise somebody with a mine, right? So what did he do? He put his Confederate prisoners in front of his men, and they would die. And eventually the Confederates stopped doing some of the mines. So, I mean, he was pretty brutal, but he was usually in reaction to the needs of the campaign. Again, they destroyed thousands of miles, or hundreds of miles of rail lines, but did they destroy every building? Did they destroy every house they went by? No. They took a lot of food, though, and it definitely hurt the civilians. But again, it was their mission, you know, that needed that food.
Often the stories are passed down too about, you know, hatred for Sherman. I was giving a presentation on the March to the Sea, and this lady came up and she was talking about her great grandmother had essentially told her that Sherman's men had came through the town in which they lived and had raped her and her family. And so I had a map up, and I said, well, where did your family live? And she pointed to it on the map, and it was about 200 miles away from wherever Sherman's men had marched.
Right.
So this sort of hatred is Sherman, it builds over time.
Yes.
And a lot of this is projected backward.
Yep. Yeah, it's I mean, hey, was Sherman the nicest guy in the world? Probably not. But his goal was to win the war. Same with Grant's, and they were a shared mind. And I would say with Lincoln as well. You know, Lincoln would have loved to not have the war, of course. It killed him. And he did think that most people in the South were not Confederates, and they thought they were being led by just a radical small percentage. But he soon, you know, was dissuaded by that, by the events of the war. Same with Grant. And his goal was to, you know, restore the Union any way possible.
So generally, do you think rules of warfare, even when prescribed, are followed?
No, obviously. I mean, I would say in general they were. You know, in general, most men didn't fire houses, didn't rape women, didn't kill civilians outright. Yes, they're, you know, society's going to be made up of good and bad, and I would say in the percentages of the Army, there was like percentages of men that, you know, morals were questioned, obviously, and took part in that. But Grant, you know, at least in the Vicksburg campaign, as I studied, did punish some men for activity that he had outlawed as far as his general order for the Vicksburg campaign. So, you know, he was somewhat true to his word, but of course, a general's not going to know every action and not get reported. So I'm sure some men did get away with their brutality.
Yeah, and it's often in these types of wars where you see when both sides engaging in this, you're doing the wrong thing, and the finger pointing going back at them, but essentially one side will justify it as a need. We have to do it in order to fight and continue to survive. And so they start bending the rules. So it becomes real fuzzy as to what is prescribed rules of warfare and who abides by them. And that's one of the hard things to really define.
And I think most historians would agree that the war overall was not a total war, I think, at this point. But there were areas that it might have been. The brutality in Missouri and Kansas during the war, where there was a sometimes very invisible line between combatants and the civilians, where somebody knew you were pro-Union, you were going to get shot by the pro-secession, you know, the pro-Confederate forces, and likewise with the Union men. And I don't think anybody was, you know, didn't have blood on their hands in that conflict. And there was other areas where there was very severe guerrilla fighting in eastern Tennessee and parts of western Virginia. It was brutal, and men died, civilians died, women died, you know, by the hands of the opposing forces. But I guess when I say that the war wasn't total, again, it wasn't total from the Union's perspective of how they fought the war, and it wasn't total across. It wasn't the Eastern Front in World War II with the Soviets and the Germans. But there were total war aspects of it, and I would agree that in some ways it was on the path towards total war, but definitely wasn't a total war when you think about World War II and other wars in the 20th century.
So any last questions? All right, I'd like to thank Thomas Mack for his
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you for your time.